Hey guys, how you doing? So welcome to the second video for chapter 4. In this video we're going to take a look at the circulatory system and we're going to focus on that one. It may become a long video because there's a lot to talk about and we're going to look at the circulatory system in a lot of depth. Okay, so let's jump into it. Okay, now the circulatory system. The circulatory system is also known as the cardiovascular system, and it is the transport system for mammals. Okay, if you think about the way that the system works, it provides a link from the external environment to the cell. Every single one of your cell requires nutrients and needs to remove waste, and so there needs to be something that allows the transport between the external environment and the cell, and so that's what the circulatory system is meant to do. Yeah. Now, the best analogy I can sort of think about it is if you think about roads and houses in a suburb or a city. Okay. Every single one of your cells needs oxygen and nutrients, and so if you think about what your house needs, things like groceries and food, right? It also needs to remove nitrogen waste from the cells and needs to transport it out of the cell and then out of the body eventually, and carbon dioxide out of the cells and to the lungs, because those things are toxic. And so you've got here the good stuff that you need to come in is the oxygen and nutrients, and then the bad stuff that needs to go out, the nitrogen waste and the carbon dioxide from your cells, as being the garbage. And so those two things need to be taken to the house and taken away from the house. And so what do we use? We use cars, we use vehicles, garbage trucks. When you go to when you go grocery shopping, you need to use the road to do that, right? And so if you can imagine if a city or a suburb didn't have roads, how difficult it would be to actually remove or gain some of those things. You'd have to go from one cell to the next cell, or from one house to the next cell, to the next house, to the next house, in order to get rid of the garbage or to bring the groceries back in. Yeah. The circulatory system allows a direct link from the cell to the external environment, and it eventually kind of congregates and then it gets rid of it through a different organ altogether. Okay, so what does it consist of? It consists of the heart, which is a muscular pump to move the blood. Here is a diagram of your heart, or it's kind of like an animated picture. It's not real, but I think it's very accurate. That's what your heart actually looks like as it's pumping. Your circulatory system also has blood vessels, which is the channels that the blood travels through, and that's where all the stuff goes in. It goes into the blood and it moves around the body, and you can sort of see represented by the blue and the red blood vessels there. And it also has a network of what we call capillaries, which is the site where materials can be exchanged between blood and the cells. And so actually your capillaries has kind of the most kind of extensive network. It looks pretty much like a very, very branched kind of root system around the body, but that's because it needs to reach every single cell in your body in order for the cells to remove the waste and take in the nutrients and the oxygen. And so that's actually why your capillary network around your body is so extensive. Yeah, here is just sort of like a diagram to show what that might look like. You've got your heart, you've got your major blood vessels, and then you've got all the small branches being the capillary networks. All of those things form the circulatory system. Okay. Now, here's a fairly important diagram to understand how the circulatory system works. And so we're going to go through some of these things, and there's a lot of terminology that you guys may need to be familiar with, so you have to bear with me. Okay. Here's the structure. Yeah. The heart in the center, right where the chest is, slightly to the left. Okay. And within the heart, you have 4 different chambers. You have the left atrium. Now, this left, even though on the diagram looks like the right, is kind of like your left. So if you were to imagine your heart being on your chest, the left side is the left atrium, and the left side is the left ventricle. So it's facing you, okay? The right side is the right atrium and the right ventricle there. You can see there, one side will pump the red blood that's represented in red here being oxygen-rich and CO2 poor, basically oxygen-rich blood, to the systemic circuit, which is the rest of the body. This is where your brain, your kidneys, your stomach, all of the parts of your body is called the systemic circuit, and it uses up that oxygen, and then it comes back around and redeposits back into your heart, into the right atrium, and then your heart then actually pumps it to the pulmonary circuit, which is your lungs. And your lungs is what allows the gas exchange to occur, which oxygenates your blood and removes the carbon dioxide from your blood. And so once it is filled up there, and then it comes back to the heart and the left atrium and gets repumped around the body. Now you can see there is an extensive capillary network in the pulmonary circuit where the lungs are, and there's also an extensive capillary network in the systemic circuit, which is where the rest of the body is. Yeah, and so those two things are represented in this diagram as a bit of a figure 8 kind of movement. Okay, now if blood is in a vessel that moves away from the heart, we call that the artery, and then if blood moves in a vessel towards the heart, we call that a vein. Okay, now it's really important to make some of those distinctions. Now the pathway for blood to travel, first of all, fresh oxygenated blood travels from the lungs to the left side of the heart. So it goes from the lungs there to the left side of the heart into the left atrium, and then what happens is the blood then pumps down to the ventricle and then out, oxygenated blood to the rest of the body into the systemic circuit, which is where it gets used up. And then what happens is once it is used up, it becomes deoxygenated, meaning it's lost its oxygen. Deoxygenated blood then returns to the heart through the systemic vein, which is here, right? Goes into the atrium, and then it gets pumped back to the lungs, which is in the pulmonary artery. Yeah. Now notice how in some of these instances, the artery does not necessarily mean that it contains oxygen-rich blood. Okay. For example, this pulmonary artery contains oxygen-poor blood because it's going to the lungs. It's going away from the heart to the lungs. The systemic artery is, however, oxygen-rich because it goes from the heart away to the rest of the body. And once again, in the vein coming from the lungs back to the heart is oxygen-rich, but the vein coming from the body back to the heart is oxygen-poor. So that's important to make the distinction. And then finally, the blood becomes oxygenated at the lungs. Okay, so that's the general pathway. Now, this diagram is obviously oversimplified. We're basically representing every other organ in your body with this particular systemic circuit diagram. However, in real life, this forms the bulk of your kind of capillary network, and then this forms a very small part. However, they both perform different functions in terms of the blood usage. Okay. Now, let's start by looking at what's in the blood and why is that important to understand. Okay, so the average adult male contains about 5 or 6 liters. And females will have about 4 to 5 liters of blood. Now, 55% of the blood contains a particular component called plasma, which is made up of mainly water, but it also contains plasma proteins and other molecules. This is where all your nutrients sit in the plasma. Okay, the plasma suspends the blood cells, and it contains substances that allows your body to maintain its osmotic pressure, water balance and stuff like that. And then it promotes clotting and contributes to the immune response. Okay, it also transports the nutrients, waste, and carbon dioxide and other substances. Yeah. So what it does is basically this is where all of the good stuff and the bad stuff sits in your blood. Whenever you eat food and your digestive system takes out sugar from that food, it goes into the blood, and that's where it sits. Okay, and then the next component is the white blood cells, which, oops, sorry guys, got a little bit distracted there. The next component is the white blood cells, which forms less than 1% of your blood, and its function is like the police force. Yeah, it's going to destroy any foreign cells or debris that gets into it, and because your blood is your transport system or your highway around every cell, the white blood cells sort of sit inside the blood, because it acts as an immune response. Whenever there needs to be an immune response, blood rushes to that location and white blood cells begin to activate and perform that particular function. Okay, the platelets, a different type of cell, again, forming less than 0.01% of your blood. It is the main agent in clotting your blood. It stops your blood from leaking and continuously leaking by clotting it up and kind of forming that blockage, which over time forms your scab. Okay. And then finally, your red blood cells form the 45%. Yeah, the red blood cells is what carries the oxygen and the carbon dioxide around your body, which you need for energy. Okay. Okay, let's start with red blood cells. Blood cells are produced in the bone marrow. They are not produced in the blood or the blood vessels. They are produced in bone marrow from these particular cells called stem cells. Okay. And blood contains 3 different types of cells, yeah, which are specialized from those stem cells in the bone marrow. Okay, the red blood cells are called erythrocytes. The white blood cells are called leukocytes, and the platelets are called platelets. Right, and so each one has a different function. And they last slightly different in terms of the number, or they vary in terms of the function, the number, and also the time that they stay alive in. Okay, so you've got heaps of red blood cells, and then each of your red blood cells will last about 120 days or so, or about 4 months. Okay, your platelets really important for blood clotting. You have about 250 to 500,000, and they last about 1 week. Okay, and your white blood cells are produced and they're active in defense, and you have about 5 to 7,000. And they may survive for several days. If you have an infection, the white blood cells are actually kind of like sacrificial, like kind of police force, which means they only last a few hours, because once they fight the infection, they also die and get killed by the body as well. Okay, your red blood cells contain a particular molecule called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a protein, and it is a red iron-rich protein that binds together with oxygen. Okay. And so it is that binding to oxygen in the hemoglobin that allows red blood cells to carry oxygen around the body. Each hemoglobin molecule can bind up to 4 oxygen atoms, and this is the primary method by which oxygen is transported to all the cells. Okay, from a chemical perspective, your red blood cells contain the molecule hemoglobin in kind of like in the center, and the hemoglobin protein is woven around with several different polypeptide chains, and then what happens is each one has a particular site that allows it to bind to an oxygen molecule, and that's where the iron is. That is why you need iron in your blood, because iron is the atom that binds to the oxygen, which then allows your body to transport oxygen around the body. So if you are poor in oxygen, if you are iron deficient, you will also find that you are unable to bind oxygen to your blood, and therefore you don't have as much energy as you kind of need in order to do your daily activities. Okay. And so you can sort of see there, this hemoglobin acts as an oxygen carrier, and it carries the oxygen, and then it also dumps the oxygen into wherever it's needed in the tissues. Okay. Now, your white blood cells and your platelets, white blood cells, your leukocytes combat infection. They move around in the bloodstream through the connective and epithelial tissue, and they ingest bacteria and foreign bodies. Okay. So here is a diagram showing the white blood cell in action. You can sort of see there that this one has just captured its prey. In a second, the little GIF is going to reactivate, and you can sort of see the white blood cell moving around. There's your little bacteria trying to run away. It follows it through the connective tissues, in between your epithelial tissues and things like that. And then eventually, it'll engulf it through endocytosis. It'll go into the lysosome and digest the bacteria, okay? And that's what your leukocytes do. Now, in Unit 3 and 4, you look at this in much more detail about immune response and how that works. But for now, this is kind of just all you need to know. The platelets, important for blood clotting, and comprise of fragments of larger cells, which then kind of bind together to block your blood from leaking out of the wound that you have. Okay. Now, just a few examples of things that can go wrong. Often we learn about these things, but it's good to sort of understand how do they affect real life like issues and illnesses that people have. What can go wrong with the blood? Aplastic anemia is one of the conditions that can go wrong when the bone marrow doesn't produce enough new blood cells to replace the old ones. Remember, your blood cells have a time limit or a time frame in which they survive, and so they need to be replaced. If you have aplastic anemia, your bone marrow doesn't replace them or doesn't produce enough of the new ones, and so what happens is not only are the red blood cells lacking, all your blood cells are lacking, and some of the causes to that is toxic chemicals, radiation, and viral infections. Okay, many of the cases are usually unknown, but the treatment usually includes some sort of blood transfusion or bone marrow transplant in severe cases to allow the body to then replenish the supply of blood cells. Okay, leukemia, you guys have probably heard about it before. It's a cancer that affects the bone marrow. And now remember, the bone marrow is what produces the white blood cells, and so leukemia affects the bone marrow, and it produces a large number of white blood cells. The abnormal number don't die as fast as the regular ones, and it overcrowds the blood and interferes with normal blood functions, which, you know, if you think about it, can be very, very severe and detrimental to the body, because those functions include getting energy around the body to the different organs. And so if you don't get the oxygen around there and the nutrients around, the body suffers from severe effects and and damage. Okay. Some of the risk factors include chemical exposure, particularly benzene, radiation and smoking, and treatments include chemotherapy, radiotherapy, and cell transplants there. Okay, so those are just some sort of case studies there. Okay. Now, once we look at the blood, we're going to look at the blood vessels. Now, blood vessels, this is meant to say the blood vessels pump the blood or transports the blood around the body. They carry the blood. Yeah, there are three main types that you have: arteries, which take blood away from the heart. The arteries are broken further down. Okay, they're broken down into arterioles, and then they're broken down then into capillaries. Okay, like branches of a trunk, they branch out from large to medium to small, etc., etc. And then your veins take blood towards the heart, and they're also composed of venules, which is your branches of the veins. Okay, and then in between your arteries and your veins are your capillaries, yeah, which is where the exchange of materials occur. So if you think about the progression from one side to the other, it starts off as a major branch, within the heart, breaking off into an artery. The artery then branches off, the main highway branches off into your kind of avenues, your arterioles, which then break down into your capillaries, represented by the purple there. And your capillaries is where the exchange in your cells happen. And then what happens is everything else collects from the capillaries, from the cells into the capillaries, and then they reform your venules, which then form your veins, which then takes back to the heart. Okay, and so that's kind of the structure of your blood vessels, right? Arteries are thick-walled. That's the distinguishing feature between arteries and veins, or one of the distinguishing features. And they take blood away from the heart, and this doesn't mean that it's always oxygenated. Okay. Now, why are they thick? They're thick because they're high in blood pressure, and that's the characteristic of arteries. They are high in blood pressure because they've just left the heart, and the heart has just pumped the blood through the artery and is going somewhere at a very fast pace because it's high pressure. Okay. So it starts being very thick because it needs to contain that pressure and withstand the pressure that's there. Once it gets down into the arterioles, it loses pressure along the way. It slowly loses pressure because it's being divided into smaller branches, and those branches are being divided again. And so naturally, it will drop in pressure until it gets to the capillaries, in which the pressure then drops to zero. Yeah. Whilst blood is in the artery, it's too thick for any major exchange to occur. Right. So it's really just there to get the blood straight to the cells as fast as possible, or straight to the particular location. And then it branches out to become arterioles, which then turn into capillaries. Your largest artery is called your aorta, which is the one that it connects directly to the heart and takes it right down your main body. Okay, that's what it looks like right there. There's your heart, and there's your main aorta. A section of the aorta goes to the kidneys, which I'll talk about in the next couple of videos. And that's what your heart looks like. It looks like one closed fist on just slightly on the left side of your chest. Okay, the capillaries are thin-walled vessels that allow exchange of materials between blood and cells. They're the most kind of like important in terms of the exchange of stuff. Okay, they sit about 5 to 8 micrometers in diameter, and they are only one cell thick. Think about why they are only one cell thick in order to do that. Okay, blood pressure needs to drop at the capillaries because that's where the exchange happens. And then you've also got a different type of vessels called lymphatic vessels, which then are present to collect any sort of leftover material. But that's sort of what it looks like there. Yeah, there is your arteriole, and then you'll notice as it breaks off, it is only one cell thick because it only wants to allow as much branching and as much exchange as possible to the surrounding cell tissues. Okay, and so this diagram is really in depth to show you what it looks like. Yeah, it starts at the arteriole, it breaks off, and your red blood cells really are only one cell thick to transport around. Right. So if you imagine this is your cells. The blood travels through the capillaries, and there the blood pressure is almost zero. It moves very, very slowly, but as it moves, this is what allows the exchange to happen. This allows diffusion to occur. It allows active transport to occur. It allows endo and exocytosis to occur between the blood and the cells of your body. Okay, and so what happens is each of these connective tissues then rebranch together, and then it reforms your veins, or your venules, then reforms your veins. And then what happens is you also have your lymphatic tissue, which then collects any sort of excess fluids and things like that, as well as a bit of a kind of a just in case or backup system that sits around there as well. So you've got lymph nodes that collect extra fluid from your body all the time. Okay. As blood travels to the capillaries, blood pressure drops, allowing the exchange to occur, and it prevents damage to the cells. At the capillaries, oxygen then diffuses into the endothelial cells, which is endo meaning inside, yeah, within the layer of your blood vessels, and to the tissue cells, okay? And this makes the blood oxygenated. At the same time, carbon dioxide from the cell diffuses the other way and into the blood, and so that's how your cells get rid of the carbon dioxide that they produce from respiration that we've learned in the previous chapter, okay? Glucose, amino acids, and any other inorganic molecules also diffuse through the gap and go into or out of the cell depending on usage and production. And then your white blood cells will also squeeze in between the gaps in the tissue cells to combat any sort of infection, okay? Your capillaries look like this. You've got 4 cells which are extremely thin, and they're called endothelial cells. Here is the blood, and then it carries the oxygen there, and the CO2, and any other proteins you've got. And there are these small kind of pores, which then allows the exchange of material to happen as well, and that's what it looks like there. Yeah, so there's one endothelial cell, there's the nucleus of the cell, there's another one, and they all sort of join together, and there are these fine gaps in between them that allows the exchange to occur, okay? Your veins, once the capillaries have done their job, it recollects together to form your veins and transport blood back to the heart. Now, not all veins are deoxygenated because some veins come from the lungs and are therefore oxygenated. And a problem that your body encounters is that once the blood leaves the capillaries, there's no pressure left. It can't all of a sudden gain pressure because it's no longer any pressure that the heart has provided pumping blood to the cells has been lost in the capillaries, and so your veins need a different method to transport blood back to the heart, okay? In order to do that, it uses 2 things. First of all, it uses any muscle cells that contract near the veins to help squeeze the veins. If you think about the veins being this tube, the muscle cells squeeze around it every time your body moves. The muscle cells squeeze and it pushes the blood up the veins, and then what happens is the veins contain these valves which are one way and they prevent any sort of backflow. So when blood flows through, it goes one way, and then when it tries to go back, it closes these valves so blood can only travel in one singular direction and no backflow can happen in the veins, right? So here's a diagram to show what it looks like. Squeezes from the muscles around it, and then it goes through the veins and up from the flap, and then the valves will close, preventing any return of blood going backwards. Yeah, that way, over time, it allows the blood to go back to the heart. Now, this process is a lot slower. However, what it does, it means it doesn't require pressure from the heart, and the heart doesn't need to pump blood through the capillaries and rupture the capillaries, and the veins have an alternate method of getting blood back to the heart in a safe manner. And it is also why veins are generally thinner than arteries. And you can see there the one-way valves sitting in the veins that are there, okay? You can actually find these valves if you're really good at hunting them, or particularly if you're a veiny person, which I'll maybe show you guys next time, okay? Finally, let's look at the structure of the heart. Now, what does the heart do? The heart pumps blood around the body, and that's its main function, and it always needs to pump blood around the body. It is about the same thickness as your fist, and it pumps about 4 to 8 liters of blood per minute. Now, that is phenomenal in terms of the amount of blood that it pumps. 4 to 8 liters, if you think about it, is pretty much a whole bucket that you use around for your washing and stuff like that. At rest, it usually beats about 60 to 100 beats per minute. And it consists of 4 different chambers, okay? You've got your right atrium, which receives blood from the body, right ventricle, which pumps blood to the lungs, your left atrium receives blood from the lungs, and your left ventricle pumping blood to the body, right? Now, the key thing to note here, when it pumps 2 main areas in the body, it needs to be thicker. And so ventricle walls are often thicker than atrium walls, and the left side is much thicker than the right side, and we'll have a look at why that is, right? Each of these chambers are separated by one-way valves, and so once again, blood cannot go backwards through the valves. Here's a diagram. It's a complex system, but this is sort of what it looks like here. Your right atrium, remember right being your right, if you were putting that heart diagram in front of your chest, receives blood from 2 areas, from the head and the upper torso. Basically anything above the heart goes through this tube, anything below the heart goes from here, and then it goes into the atrium through your one-way valves, which sit right here, right? And as it cuts through your one-way valves, it goes into the right ventricle, which then pumps blood up, and then what happens is the blood splits to each of your lungs to be oxygenated, yeah? It splits this side to the right lung and this side to the left lung. Once it is oxygenated by the lungs, it goes back, and you can see there the oxygenated blood from the lungs goes here into this chamber here from the right side of the lung, or the right lung, and then here into this chamber from the left, right? It goes into the left atrium, which then goes through the bicuspid valve, which is another one-way valve, goes into the ventricle. You can see the ventricle walls being thicker than the atrium walls, and then it pumps blood up through your aorta, and then parts of it or sections of it will go to your head and arms, and then the other section goes to the rest of your body, which goes down behind the heart, down towards the legs. And so that's the circulation of blood through your heart, right? You can see there, diagram showing the pathway, goes down, up, and then it returns down, and then up and around the body again, yeah? And that's the pumping action there. Now, the beating of your heart, that noise, actually comes from your one-way valves. Each valve closes in a slightly different time from the other valve, and so every time it closes, it makes the boop noise, and that's why you've got a dual boop boop, because it's pumping from the right side and the left side, which is slightly out of sync from one another, or out of time from one another there, okay? Now, a few things can go wrong with the heart. Sometimes your heart blood vessels can be blocked, and so it's a muscle and it needs blood just like every other muscle, but if the blood supply going to the heart itself is blocked, then that can create a bit of an issue. And so what doctors can do is they can actually do a coronary bypass graft surgery. So what they do is they take another blood vessel from another part to bypass the blocked area, which is basically sewing an alternative pathway for the blood to pump through there. Or you can do a coronary angioplasty. Yeah, it's a non-surgical, and what they do is they insert a long hollow tube called a catheter into the aorta, usually from the groin, which is very painful. And then the tube pumps up to the push blockage against the wall of the artery, and then a fine metallic mesh called a stent is then inserted to prevent the walls from collapsing. So it's a pretty smart move. The catheter goes right up the blood vessels, goes to the block site, pumps it open like that, and then the stent holds it in place, allowing blood to then pump through. Yeah, so it's a very, very, in terms of its medical procedure, not that invasive, very, very safe, and also very, very successful as well.